You gotta come celebrate the best tacos in Texas at the Texas Monthly Taco Fest on June 7th at Discovery Green. You'll get to sample some of the best taquerias around as appointed by the one and only Texas Monthly Taco Editor. This celebration of the 50 best tacos in Texas is gonna feature live music, drinks, and my favorite part, all the tacos you can handle and more. Get your tickets now at texasmonthly.com/tacofest. The largest pop culture festival in Texas is back at the George R. Brown Convention Center from June 20th to June 22nd, Comic Palooza. And there is so much to do at Comic Palooza, so dress up as your favorite character. I'll probably be in a Batman costume, and check out the different exhibitors on the show floor, stop by the Okashi Japanese arcade area, or visit one of the many celebrity panels. Get your tickets now at comicpalooza.com/CityCastHouston. Today on CityCast Houston, ICE activity has been ramping up in Houston with over 500 people deported in one roundup this month. But we wanted to know, are these all criminals or are regular Houstonians getting caught up in Trump's immigration crackdown? To answer that, I'm bringing on award-winning immigration reporter Anna-Cat Brigida. It's Tuesday, May 27th. I'm Raheel Ramzanali, and here's what Houston's talking about. So, Anna-Cat, you were with us here on CityCast Houston right when Donald Trump was inaugurated, and we talked about how this immigration crackdown would unfold and learned about what the administration is going to do. Are things happening like you expected them to?
I think in many ways, things are happening as expected. Donald Trump promised to ramp up his immigration enforcement. We have seen that. I think if it hasn't been to such a great scale as he said, it's more of because of a lack of resources, just because, ICE depends on having agents and investigating people and figuring out where they live. So it's not necessarily just a simple thing for ICE to carry out all of these mass deportations. But we definitely are seeing a lot of ICE activity in the Houston area. We're also seeing a lot of people who are getting their visas stripped or their statuses revoked. And so that's putting people in a vulnerable position as well in terms of potentially being a target of ICE enforcement when they might not have been before.
Yeah, and we're going to focus on some of those individual stories in just a second. But, sticking on ICE here, I got to bring up this big roundup. And by the way, ICE is, of course, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They completed this big roundup here in Houston just this month where federal agents, they spent a week on this operation and announced that there were over 400 arrests and over 500 deportations from Houston. But Anna-Cat, what do we really know about the people who were deported or arrested?
Yeah, so ICE has given some information about some of the people that it's detaining and deporting, but really we don't have that much information. And I think one thing that's always important to remember is when ICE says, okay, we rounded up 500 people, just to remember that ICE has been doing immigration enforcement for years. It's not fully new. There is an increase in that activity, but it's also something that ICE has been doing for many years. So in many ways, I do think that part of it is creating the narrative of cracking down and sharing more of that information. I've definitely noticed as a reporter getting way more ICE press releases ever since the Donald Trump administration started. A lot of those are focusing on, saying how many criminals are among the people that they've detained, but often there's not much information about that. So, criminal by ICE standards could be someone with a DUI or something like that, which, obviously still considered a criminal activity. But I think some people might consider some of those to be, lesser crimes. And, it's not always people who are murderers and carrying out violent crimes.
Yeah, and that is one of the big things, it seems like from the outside looking in, with the ramped up press releases, the headlines about these big roundups, is to create fear. And Like when I'm talking to people, when you're talking to people, do you get that sense like this fear is there now because of all of these stories?
Yeah, I definitely do get the sense of fear from people who both are undocumented, don't have a status, don't have any status, and people who have some sort of status or protections from deportation, like people who have an ongoing asylum case or DACA. They're really scared about that being taken away from them and then becoming a target. And I've definitely heard anecdotally of people, not wanting to drive, not wanting to go to work. I've heard a lot about just anecdotally people being scared of workplace raids, particularly in the construction industry. So, not really wanting to go to those areas that they feel like are potentially going to be a place that's going to become a target. And then obviously, that affects individual people's lives, and it also affects all of us here in Houston.
Yeah, it really is. Like, for example, I have a friend who works in the construction industry, right? He works in backyards, and he's had three vendors who have been working with him for years. They've been deported, right? And, talking to him, he's trying to help them out. And, he told me that, these are guys that were paying their taxes, that were here helping out in the economy, helping out with these businesses, making a living for themselves and their family. And they're gone now. And there is this fear of, am I going to be next? Right. With a lot of undocumented workers here. And this fear is real. But for people who live here, it's going to impact you as well, in that there's not going to be enough workers. Things are going to cost more because it's harder to find workers. So, all this kind of plays hand in hand.
Right, exactly. Obviously, there are individuals who are impacted, and we cover that a lot in the media, but it really goes beyond just those individual stories.
Speaking of individual stories, let's talk about some of the people you've been following. And I want to start with Eric Payan, who was arrested in one of the biggest ICE raids that we've seen here in the Houston region when agents targeted Colony Ridge, which is a largely Latino community in Liberty County. Tell me about Eric Payan, who he is, what happened to him in that raid, and what's the latest?
Yeah, so Eric Payan, he runs a tire shop in Colony Ridge. He's very well known in the community. I think it's a good example of, kind of people working in our communities. The someone that you go to get tires from can get wrapped up in this. And so he's originally.
And they've been there for 20 years, by the way. So they really are part of that community.
Exactly. That is such an important part of it. I think a lot of people who are getting caught up in this are people who have been here for many, many years, decades even. He's originally from Mexico and, supports his family. Some of his daughters have some health issues that he helps with as well. And so he was caught up in this raid in Colony Ridge. He has since been released on bond. So basically what that means is that he was in detention for about a month. And he had a hearing, and he was able to make a case for why he should go through his immigration proceedings outside of detention. And a judge agreed with that and granted him a bond. So he paid so that he could get let out. He is still in immigration proceedings. So that means that, he'll still go before a judge to see if he can stay in the US. He could still be ordered deported. That is still a possibility. The cases go through immigration court a bit more slowly once they're outside of detention. So it could be a process that takes years, but if down the line he's able to be eligible for some immigration status. So in his case, most likely from maybe a relative, a daughter, or one of his grandchildren who is a U.S. citizen and can eventually sponsor him. That would be kind of probably his way to be able to legally stay in the U.S., to have a legal status.
Did Eric Payan have a criminal record or any pending criminal charges?
He did not have any criminal charges to my knowledge, which I also think, illustrates that there's many people who don't have a run-in with the law and who are caught up in this.
So to play the other side, right? He's been here for 20 years. Was he on the path to citizenship? Was he trying to become a citizen? Do we know anything about that?
Well, like many people, I think he would like to be on that path, but that option has not been available for him. He, runs his own tire shop. So he doesn't have an employer to sponsor him. His family, at least not yet, they're not eligible to sponsor him.
Mm.
Children have to be at least 21 years old to sponsor their parents. So that's something that could happen in the future, but it's just not available to him right now.
Nothing says a Texas road trip like heading to the cowboy capital of the world, Bandera, Texas. And they're doing Friday Night Lights with a cowboy twist. You gotta check out the Riding on Faith 2025 Summer Series Rodeo, which kicks off every Friday night from May 30th through July 25th at Mansfield Park in Bandera. I love live music, and Bandera keeps the music playing, from big-name headliners to classic honky-tonks. And this summer, Bandera is proud to be one of 7 Texas cities to host a special traveling exhibit from the Smithsonian called Crossroads, Change in Rural America. And it highlights how rural communities have changed in the last century. Experience this engaging, interactive display from June 21st to July 26th at the Bandera Middle School. Start planning your road trip now at banderacowboycapital.com. Bandera, Texas. Cowboy dreams begin here.
ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track, and ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
This is where my frustration always kicks in, not only with this current administration, but this is something that my family has gone through, being an immigrant myself. It took us a very long time to become citizens of the United States. It is not easy. It is expensive, right? So if there was a path, if there was something that was easier and there was a guaranteed timeline, things would be so different. And, that's just my experience. And I'm going to share some of that in this conversation as well. But I want to get back to Eric Payan for a second. While he was being held, what happened with his family? Because you mentioned his daughter had a medical emergency as well. The day that he was rounded up, his daughter was actually getting her legs amputated. And his wife had to deal with that, with Eric Payan being taken by ICE, trying to manage the business, all of this. How did they manage this?
Well, it was definitely a stressful time for the family, as it is for so many families. He was a provider. His wife does help with the tire shop, but, that's the way that he provides for his family. And so that obviously has, just causes a lot of stress to the family. And when someone goes into detention, like Eric Payan, his family didn't necessarily know that he would get out in a month. So they don't know if, they're just trying to hold themselves over for a month, or they don't know if he's going to be deported to Mexico very soon. And then, it's going to be an even more serious financial burden for them because, then bills still need to be paid, no matter what. And so even though, it ended up being a shorter time period for them, so many families don't know that and don't know how long it's going to take and how much of an impact it can have on them.
Yeah, it just seems like this administration, what they're doing is they are rounding up people who, are providing for their families and almost like trying to break a family, right? For example, one of my friends, her babysitter had to self-deport because her husband was rounded up in a raid, was deported, and she couldn't make it here, right? Being an immigrant in a city that she's not familiar with, she just couldn't survive. So she had to self-deport and go to her husband. I keep hearing these stories. Are you hearing this as well?
Yeah, I definitely think in terms of self-deportations or people who want to or who decide to leave, I think I've heard kind of both ends of it. Definitely hearing some people feeling that they could be pressured into that, but then also a lot of people just feeling like they can't do that. They can't go back to their home countries. They're scared to go back to their home countries. they know that they, can't make a living in their home country, and they need to kind of stick it out financially so that they can at least, earn some money. So I think there's so many people who are making that calculation. And some people are deciding, to be with their family or deciding that that's the best option for them. But it's definitely not an easy decision for anyone to go through. And there's a lot of different factors that are going into people's decisions.
Anna-Cat, I want to move to another individual that was getting a lot of headlines, and he shared his story, and it was the math professor at the University of Houston. What happened with him and what we learned about his case?
Okay, so young son John was a assistant professor at the University of Houston, and he unexpectedly had his visa revoked. And so basically he was forced to pick up and leave his life. And I think it's one of those examples we've seen so much that universities, both professors and students, we've seen so many visas get revoked. And I think that is one thing that has maybe been a little bit unexpected for some people, even, people who support some of these deportation plans, because I think that maybe people didn't think about the situation of international students and how precarious that situation can be, that they do have a legal status, but, they don't necessarily have a long-term pathway to being in the US. And I think it's also just had very much a chilling effect because, we're not talking about people who are crossing the border. We're talking about people who had a visa to enter the country for a very specific reason. Yeah. And they're also losing that opportunity. So I think it's just another example of how the crackdown has been pretty widespread.
Okay, with Professor John, again, you can sense the frustration in my voice, but with Professor John, he had to go back to South Korea in April. Did we hear why? Did he have criminal charges? Was there a criminal background?
I mean, I think that the questions that you have are the questions that, a lot of people have about some of these people being stripped of their status, which is why. What is the logic behind it? Yeah. I think we'd have to get into Donald Trump's head to know exactly some of the logic of what's going on. I mean, definitely in terms of universities and university students, the trend has seemed to be, people who were involved in protests, different types of activism, political activity, and targeting people for that reason, and kind of having somewhat of a silencing effect to go after people who were sharing their opinion, which obviously is, a tenet in our country, written in our Constitution, the principle of free speech.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I'm glad you brought that up, right? Like the weaponizing of revoking your visa because a student might be, pro-Palestine or is voicing their opinion about something that this administration or somebody else doesn't agree with. And weaponizing this now, it just seems like it is the scariest thing possible for a student that has a visa. For a professor, that one still makes no sense. But the weaponizing of this is so scary.
Yeah, and it very much seems that is the point of it all, is to have this chilling effect, to send a message to other people.
Mm-hmm. Anna-Cat, there's another family that you've been following, and this story just shows how complex our immigration system is. I've shared my thoughts on it, but with this family, you can be married to a U.S. citizen, lived here, pretty much your whole life, and you can still be worried about being deported. Can you tell me about Efrain Ortega and his situation, which is a little different from the other people you've talked about so far?
So Efrain Ortega is a longtime Houstonian. He came to the U.S. at the age of 9 with his parents. He's one of many who came at a young age. And basically made the U.S. his home. And, anyone who would meet him would look at him and just assume that he probably has lived in Houston his whole life. And he's married to a U.S. citizen, his wife, Kristen. They have a pretty young infant son. They have now 8 kids between the two of them. And Efrain is really the provider for them. He works as a barber. And I think it's just one of those examples of, someone you would just see in your community and not really think about what their backstory is.
So Efrain is a DACA recipient, right? What's the latest on that program and how is it going to impact him
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest misconceptions that so many people have about the immigration system is that you marry a US citizen or you have a US citizen child, and all of a sudden you become a citizen. And that is not how it works. It's actually a very complicated process. And there's many, many people who are actually not eligible to go through that process, basically because of the way that they entered the country. So for people who entered the country without authorization, so usually entering at the border, those people are usually not eligible to normalize their status through their spouses. For a lot of those people, what you have to do is you have to leave the country and then do the paperwork at the embassy or the consulate in your home country. But the issue is that it often triggers a ban on entering the US, which can be up to 10 years.
Wow.
And so many people are skeptical to do that for obvious reasons, especially people who, have roots here, have wives, husbands, children here, don't want to get stuck outside of the country. So there was an attempt to fix that issue under the Biden administration, but unfortunately it did not move forward. It got blocked by the courts. And so Ephraim, he has DACA and he's been trying to legalize his status through his wife and just hasn't been able to so far. And DACA does still exist. People who have DACA, still have that protection.
Mm-hmm.
But with, the entire political climate, there's just a lot of fear in terms of that protection maybe not existing in the future. And then for Ephraim, that would put him in a very difficult situation because he wouldn't have a clear way to legalize his status, and then he would also lose his deportation protection.
Anna-Cat, you talked to Ephraim recently. What is his big fear right now?
Yeah, I think Ephraim, he feels a combination of fear and frustration. He does still have DACA. He does know that gives him some protection. But it's just been a very long process for him to try to legalize his status. And he was trying to get permission to travel outside of the US, which would allow him to then come back and legalize his status through his wife. And he tried to do that twice and was not given the permission. And so he's just been very frustrated of just trying over and over and over to try to make sure he has that, protection more than DACA, protection that is a little bit firmer, that can't be taken away from him. And he's going to have to renew his DACA in the next few months. And so that's definitely kind of feels like a weight hanging over him.
Hi, this is Joe from Vanta. In today's digital world, compliance regulations are changing constantly, and earning customer trust has never mattered more. Vanta helps companies get compliant fast and stay secure with the most advanced AI, automation, and continuous monitoring out there. So whether you're a startup going for your first SOC 2 or ISO 27001, or a growing enterprise managing vendor risk, Vanta makes it quick, easy, and scalable. And I'm not just saying that because I work here. Get started at vanta.com.
Fellas, you know Degree Cool Rush deodorant, right? Well, last year they changed the formula, and guys were mad about it. One dude even started a petition. So guess what? Degree heard us, admitted they messed up, and brought the original Cool Rush scent back exactly how it was. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So grab some and remember why its cool, crisp, and fresh scent made it the #1 men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory for all of us.
It just seems like across multiple administrations, like common sense is just lost. Like his kids are citizens. His wife is a citizen. He's here. He's adding to our community, our economy, making our city a better place, our country a better place. And yet we're still going to put that fear in his heart. It makes no sense.
It's one of the challenges of covering the immigration system. And I do believe that if people better understood the system, their political views might change, because I think a lot of the views are based on some assumptions about people and how they can legalize their status and how easy that they think that is when it's just really not the case.
Yeah. One other thing that I think about a lot is during the campaign season, President Trump put Houston on the national map, and there was a lot of traction about going after quote unquote criminal immigrants during the campaign because of the tragic murder of Jocelyn Nungarai and the two Venezuelans that were charged in that case, right? And we all know about it. We heard about it. You wrote about it. How do we kind of put this all in context in terms of what President Trump was saying and going after, again, these criminal immigrants and who the roundups are now targeting and like what's actually playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think when talking about that case, it's always important to just say that obviously it's a huge tragedy. Whoever committed that crime should be brought to justice. I don't think anyone has ever questioned that in terms of conversation around it. But I think it's also important to look at the bigger picture. In the Houston landing, we did try to look into the numbers of Tren de Aragua members or supposed Tren de Aragua members in Houston. It's very, very low. It's a very, small group of people, maybe even a handful. That's how small it potentially might be. And so I think it's important to look at the bigger picture. We also, in the landing, we got some data on charges filed in Harris County for almost a decade. And it does show citizenship status. And so we were able to look at it and analyze the bigger picture. And we found that U.S. citizens are actually twice as likely to commit a crime in Harris County than non-citizens. And
Wow.
so I think it is just important to remember the bigger picture, that, of course, some immigrants do commit crimes, but it kind of generalizing when something very horrible happens is
Yeah.
not reflective of the bigger picture and can often lead to other people, people who don't have a criminal record getting swept up in a lot of this immigration enforcement.
Yeah, and if you want to read that story and dig into the numbers a little bit more and the research behind it, it's linked in our show notes. It is a very interesting read, and it's something that was, so important to see, right? To understand that rhetoric versus actual reality, like numbers don't lie. And I think it's so important, right? Like this conversation that we've just had, the reporting that you've done previously, like putting these individuals in the spotlight and like looking at these three stories, right? Efrain Ortega in DACA, Professor John having his visa revoked as an assistant professor, and Eric Payan didn't have legal status and was rounded up. When you look at all three of these stories, these individual stories, what stands out to you when you look at them all together?
I think when you look at them all together, I think you do see that a lot of the rhetoric around immigration is a lot of fear mongering. It doesn't take into consideration how difficult it is to be a legal immigrant here in this country. And I think it shows how that is only becoming more difficult. Those pathways are only closing. They're not opening up, even though, time and time again, we see studies about how immigrants boost the economy and we need immigrants in our country and how they enrich our communities. And that's just not what we see in terms of, the immigration policy, the immigration enforcement policy. That all of that research is just not translating to what we're actually seeing playing out on the ground.
Anna-Cat, as we wrap things up here, I'm going to explain something being an immigrant and what I went through. And I want to get your advice on what Houstonians can do now to help their fellow community members, right? In a post 9/11 world, being a Muslim man who had a green card, I was lucky. My family had that. We had this protected status, right? But there was still this fear in my family. My dad would actually, tell us, here's who you call if you ever get arrested or if you think you're going to get deported or if ICE gets you. That's when the fear of ICE like really ramped up in the Pakistani community. And even in college, like in my wallet, I had a card for my lawyer just in case. I still carry my green card. I'm a citizen now. I still carry it today because my dad told me to, because that's something we needed. It feels like we are in those days again. And it feels like at any moment somebody can be deported. Maybe it is just me putting myself in the shoes of our fellow immigrants. But what can we do as Houstonians to help out?
I think that's a great point, and I'm glad that you asked it, because I've actually heard from a lot of people. A lot of people have reached out, and a lot of people do want to help. And I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about all of these things, and it can feel like there's maybe no hope, but I don't think that's true at all. I think people generally want to help. I think Houstonians want to help. So I would say, there's some organizations that are always looking for volunteers. For example, Fiel Houston is one that comes to mind. They organize volunteers, have protests and things like that. So that people can share their voice. I think also anyone in the Houston area with language skills, that's, not just Spanish, but any language skills, that's so helpful. So, maybe looking into legal aid groups and see if they might need some volunteer translators, things like that. And I just think that, there are so many ways to help, and I'm glad to see that people are trying to do that and having those conversations.
Yeah. Anna-Cat, thank you so much for all of your coverage. Thank you so much for spending time with me, and I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Anna-Cat Brigida. She's an award-winning immigration reporter currently based in Houston. I've linked her work along with other stories we talked about in the show notes. Immigration is a deeply personal topic for me, being an immigrant, and it would mean so much if you could share this episode with 3 friends so they can understand how this immigration crackdown is actually impacting Houstonians. Also, please drop a rating and review of the podcast wherever you listen, and please subscribe if you haven't yet. Want more Houston news, events, recommendations, and more? Check out our daily newsletter, Hey Houston, with a link in our show notes. Thanks. That will do it for today. I'm Raheel Ramzanali. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new.